It's a pleasure to discuss today with you, Andrew. Thank you very much for accepting this interview. My name is Mathieu. I'm a VP at Dedale, part of the research team, and typically covering all the corporate strategy and investment research division at Dedale. Could you maybe quickly start by introducing yourself and your role at Board International?
Of course. First of all, I'm really glad to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I looked a lot at the various Dedale reports, and I always find them to be very interesting on the different topics. I am the VP of Strategy at Board, which is part of the reason why I'm interested in all of the reports that you put out. In my role, I focus on strategic growth initiatives across the business. And that also includes working closely with our customers, our partners, and our go-to-markets teams. And really trying to understand how the broad market trends in the EPM space are evolving so that we can guide the company the right way.
Thanks. Crystal clear. And so maybe for the sake of the audience, could you maybe quickly explain what does Board International offer, knowing that it's an enterprise performance management solution?
Of course. So as you mentioned, Board is an enterprise planning platform, and it's really there to help organizations align financial and operational decision-making in one environment. And that's probably one of the things that is a little bit unique about Board compared to many other platforms in this space. We are widely recognized for the FP&A and financial consolidation parts of the portfolio. But what some people don't know as well is we also support operational planning processes such as retail planning, merchandising, supply planning, and S&OP. And so our idea is really to connect finance with business operationally so that companies can plan demand, can do the workforce planning, the inventory planning, the sales and financial outcomes together, and do it all in one system as opposed to having multiple spreadsheets or multiple disconnected systems that's used by each function.
Thanks, crystal clear. If I remember well, Board has been founded like more than 30 years ago, and it now generates over like 150 million in revenue with double-digit growth. How did the company evolve over the past 5 years? And typically, where do you see the company in the next 5 years?
So given that I've been here for only 2 years, I don't know that I have the company history down as well as some of my colleagues. We have people at Board who have been here for 20, 25 years, and so they could answer the full evolution of the company in lots more detail than I can. But if you look a little bit more closely, so over the last 5 years, Board has really been evolving from being a strong European vendor into a global enterprise-grade platform. We've made significant investments in cloud, in AI, in financial consolidation, and enterprise scalability over this time. And we've also started to expand the company to North America, as well as move toward larger, more complex organizations. And we're going to continue on that trend, to be honest. As we see where Board strengths really lie, it's in helping larger organizations, enterprise-level organizations, 500 million plus type of companies, do planning. And so companies are looking for flexibility, fast innovation, and alternatives to some of their more rigid vendors, shall we say, are the ones that usually pick Board for their planning platforms.
Makes sense. That's a perfect transition. You mentioned 2 topics. First one, AI investment. Second one, from European player to global player with notably the North American expansion. Happy to dig deeper on these 2 topics, starting with the AI topic. AI is on the lips of everyone. But concretely, from your experience, how is AI changing the actual day-to-day workflow of a finance team?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I use AI in my everyday work as well. And so I think AI is really just the next evolution of the journey that the financial organizations have already started with the EPM platforms. If you think about what the EPM platform did for finance organizations, is the brought data together from across the enterprise, from the different systems that are sitting in silos, And it turned it into a trusted source of data with trusted reports, forecast plans that the finance team could actually use for decision making. Now, AI is going to take it to the next level at this point, and it's going to increase it by really helping to automate a lot of the analysis, pattern recognition, generating insights proactively, and also to help in the scenario modeling. So it's still going to be sitting on top of this platform that kind of has all of your data together, but now it's going to be really helping the finance team spend more time on thinking about the business and interpreting the outcomes, and less time on kind of gathering the data, reconciling the data, and doing the sort of basic entry-level analyses that AI can now take over for them.
So as the EPM is becoming kind of a system of record, aggregating data from siloed sources, now you believe AI is kind of the perfect additional layer to analyze all of that centralized data, becoming the single source of truth, and helping all the analysis and modelization that you need to do on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. And we've been actually working on this with our technical team, and probably will have a paper published soon on it on our site somewhere, TBD exactly where. But we've been talking about this. Is AI going to replace the EPM platform? And the answer that we're increasingly coming to is no. That's just not practical. The things that AI is really good at is taking kind of a well-structured data set and then adding an additional insight on top of it. What you can't do is you can't just let AI loose in all of your systems with no context, and say, okay, go get me some information that's useful at the scalable kind of enterprise level. It just doesn't have the memory at this point in time, and the cost in token consumption is astronomically high when you try to do that. So you always need to kind of do the basic work of bringing everything together so that AI can help you. And at that point, now that you have it all together in our platform, that's where you can get AI to really accelerate the work that a human being would have been doing.
And as of today, and we might talk about the customer maturity a bit later, but I wouldn't say that, well, one concern CFOs have is everything around AI governance, auditability, trust. How do you make sure that an AI-generated forecast, for instance, is something that the board will actually sign off on? Like, how do you control AI as an additional layer on top of the EPM?
Yeah, I think the most important part at this point in AI, in all of AI, is it still can't run completely independently. You need to have a human in the middle that's actually validating the work. It's not a, hey, I'm going to just let AI give me the answer and not validate it, take it for what it is and run with it. That's a recipe for disaster. And I think everybody is well aware of that, to be honest. And so when you look at AI forecasts and the way that they work within board, it's all about having that traceability and governance so that you can actually look at the decisions that AI has made when it was generating the forecast for you. And then by looking at that and analyzing, you can say, okay, were the assumptions actually reasonable? Did the input that it used come from the right sources? You kind of need to validate the work that it did to make sure that you agree with what the AI has proposed. And then based on that, you can then go to the board and say, this is an analysis that I created together with AI to say that this is where this is going, and I've reviewed it. I think it makes sense. These are the reasons why, right? That's when the board feels comfortable, is when we have that person in the middle that has actually validated the output. If somebody came to the board and said, well, I used ChatGPT on my data and it said X, so I'm going to make this decision, everybody is going to say, well, how do you know that it's actually correct? And that's where AI breaks down without that level of auditability and honestly thinking. I think a lot of people view AI as, oh, we don't need to think anymore. we can just trust the computer to do this. And the answer is no, that's not how AI actually works. You still need to think, despite having AI to help you.
Definitely. And so human in the loop remains key as part of the FP&A process typically here. And from a software perspective, do you have any specific rules or how do you make AI fully transparent, traceable, auditable?
So we're building AI very much into the system. And there's a lot of good reason for that. The main one is AI needs to have the full context of the business in order to make the right decisions. And the only way that the AI can get that full context of the business is by using a system like ours, which has all of that context as just part of, that's what an EPM platform does essentially. So it needs to understand, what's revenue, what's units, what widgets do you have, what areas or regions do you sell in, all of that information stored together. And so because we're building it as part of that system, we have a lot of control over, okay, traceability of the inputs and how does AI actually work. So we have agents that we've trained within board to really function as an analyst, an FP&A analyst, a planning analyst, a merchandising analyst, kind of taking on that role for a person, and then using the training to say, okay, if I'm going to do this kind of analysis, this is the kind of questions I need to be asking. These are the kind of execution plans I need to put together, and then recording all of that so that you can review all of those plans from the start to the finish. And that's what gives you that traceability. It's that ability to do it within the system. If could you take an outside AI agent and use it on board's data? Absolutely. But you will lose a lot of that context, and it's just not necessarily practical to do that.
Super interesting. So eventually your point is like EPM software vendors and here boards typically is acting as kind of a system of record able to provide the context to fully leverage the AI potential and make it both relevant and efficient. And so eventually you don't see a disruption here, risk here from AI native vendors, but rather an opportunity for EPM providers to extend their offering in their TAM. And maybe just to conclude on that one, your point is to say you could do that with a AI native provider that would be plugged on top of board. That's possible, but they are losing part of the context.
That's exactly right. I mean,
Okay.
the deeper you can integrate it into the context, the better off you are. And anybody who tries to take an AI native vendor and integrate it will just have to recreate that context or train that agent on the context that's already stored on board. So, if you want to go through the exercise of repeating what we've done for all of our customers, just for yourself, because you think that that's a good use of your team's resources, then, we're not going to stop you. But you'll find very quickly that the work is actually significant. And it's probably more efficient to use somebody like Board for this than to try to build it yourself.
Makes sense. And so if we take a step back and if we think at Board specifically here, and or more generally the market, what's the level of customer adoption today from an AI perspective? So AI powered use cases, AI features, AI modules, from your perspective.
Yeah, I think it's still relatively low because people are still experimenting with it. And it comes back to that trust issue that you mentioned beforehand. I think finance organizations are naturally conservative. And so they're a little bit reluctant to start using ChatGPT or something like ChatGPT directly against their data. And when we sell Board today, everybody has a question, okay, what's your AI strategy? And how is that going to affect the platform? However, at least to the customers that we really look at in retail and manufacturing, relatively few of them say, okay, well, we really need this AI feature to invest in the EPM platform. They want to know that there is a direction and a path that they can pick up with the vendor. But I don't think they're actually ready to pick it up today. So they're still very much in that experimental phase of, do you have a plan? Could we start playing with it? Can we start using it in the next 2, 3, 6 months? And then, once they start using it and see the power that AI is in the system is actually going to give them, I think that's when you will start seeing a much bigger flip to using AI in the EPM platforms. But again,
super interesting.
Not completely replacing the person, but really helping to drive faster cycles. Because I think the other kind of thesis that we have is planning should be a continuous process, right? The world is changing way too quickly for you to be able to say, I'm going to plan once a quarter or even once a month. You really need to be doing it on a daily or weekly basis. You can't do that without automation. And so this is where AI starts to become much more important, is it's making that loop be much faster. It's making those adjustments be much faster, and it's making a response to world events, which God knows we have plenty of these days, that much easier for the company to react to.
So to summarize here, from your perspective at least, it's still quite an early adoption from a customer perspective, even though there is a growing consideration with typical questions around AI roadmap, AI features being developed from a software perspective. It is progressively becoming a key purchasing criteria, but as of today, adoption remains rather low or is more on the POC phase, testing phase, rather than the production phase.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you estimate that, I don't know, like it's less than 5% that have adopted AI at scale, or is it 10%, 20?
It's probably less than 5%, maybe
Okay.
5 to 10, somewhere around there. It really depends on what you mean by at scale, because there's so many use cases within finance organizations. But specifically, if you look at FP&A or if you look at consolidation, it's definitely going to be lagging some of the easier to automate processes.
Okay. Maybe to close the AI topic and move to the international expansion. Around AI, and you touch upon that topic briefly, there's a question of monetization potential. So how do we monetize the AI use cases on top of the typical software subscription?
Mm.
Do you have any take, and it can be both specific or market overview of ways to monetize AI, knowing that it's a cost, it's supposed to generate return on investment for customers, but the variability of the way to bill it might be an issue.
Yeah, there's absolutely a transformation in the SaaS space on how you do billing. How do you charge customers? I mean, the basic idea for all pricing is you want to align your price that you charge to the customer to the value that you provide to the customer, right? And the closer you can make that alignment, the better off, both actually you and the customer feel about the purchasing of the software. But I'm not saying anything controversial here. This is just normal pricing practices. And so historically, what has happened in the SaaS space, and especially in the EPM space, is pricing got aligned to the number of people in an organization, because it's really hard to align it to anything like really, really concrete for a customer, like a use case specifically, and the value you derive from it. And so you usually end up backing up, and number of users is kind of an easy to understand metric that everybody is happy with. The problem, as you mentioned, with AI is that we actually see two pressures. On the one hand, the number of users in the system may actually be declining, because as you make people be able to work faster, you don't need as many people in the finance team. And very few companies say that finance is their source of competitive advantage and requires heavy investment, right? It's usually viewed as a cost center. So you're going to see fewer people quite often in the system because of that. Conversely, with AI, you're going to have heavier usage of the system by those people. And so I think over time, what we're going to see, and we're already starting to see it, is there's going to be a shift from a user-based sort of model to much more computationally utility-based model, either using tokens, which is what AI typically consumes, or some proxy for tokens in terms of CPU cycles, that really match the demand that you place on the system to the cost or to the price that you pay for it. It's probably going to evolve that way. It's certainly showing all the signs that people are accepting that as a way forward. And we're going to have to evolve our pricing in the same direction. In fact, we've already started to evolve that pricing for AI in that direction of looking at the consumption and consumption levels to kind of constrain a little bit of that cost, but to also match it to the benefit that you hopefully are deriving from AI.
Okay, thank you very much. Crystal clear. So smoothly switching from user-based model to a more consumption/value-based model, typically token-based one, could be the way looking forward.
Yeah, smoothly and long term. It's not an overnight switch. In case any customers of ours are listening, the existing model is staying for a while, but as we look to evolve it, it will be more tied to the AI part of the pricing will be tied to the consumption.
Makes sense. Now, covering the second topic, which is internationalization at board or the US expansion. So as introduced, Bound or is a European company founded in Switzerland. What prompted the push into the US market, and when did that shift become strategic?
So the push is very, very easy to explain. The US market is one of the largest markets for software and for the EPM software. And so, I think everybody wants to get into that US market. It's large, it's consolidated. In fact, I think Board's unique position compared to most other EPM vendors is the fact that it has a strong European market, which very few companies can actually claim as their source of competitive advantage. Because everybody goes up to the US as the first step, it seems. So about, I guess, 5-6 years ago, I think when Board was acquired by private equity, by Nordic Capital, one of the big investment thesis for the acquisition was that expansion from the European market into the untapped North American market. And so we've been on the journey for a while, but it's a challenging journey, right? Going from and by the way, everybody notices that in the opposite direction when they go from the US to Europe, it's a very challenging journey. We're just doing it backwards. And so we're facing a lot of the same challenges as somebody who's trying to enter the European market for the first time. But really, it's been a progressive, focus for the company over the last 5+ years or so to get into the US market. And I think finally we are making significant strides in that over the last kind of year or two.
And so totally understand the challenging process it might be. Anything, any lesson you have learned during that journey, or anything you would do differently in the US expansion? Like what has been kind of the main roadblocks or challenges that you have faced expanding to the US?
So the answer is plenty of lessons learned here. Some of them we did really well as a company. So we have we had a European, for example, management team in the past. We now have a US-based management team for the company, which means we have a team of people who understands the US market probably better than the past generation, simply because that's where everybody has grew up. It's kind of natural. We've really started to focus our attention on driving the sales in the US, using the relationships that the team has to connect with customers, to help kind of accelerate the sales cycle. The big lesson is it's just harder than we expected. Going from zero to significant amounts of business is a lot harder than we expected. And it turns out to be not even so much the software or the company itself as Board, but it's actually the entire ecosystem around it that we've started, that we in Europe started to take for granted almost, that we have this support. So for example, sales partners. We have a very strong partner ecosystem at Board who can come in, advise CFOs, help build applications in Board, take on a lot of that work And also even bring board into situations which we wouldn't have been able to get into ourselves. We have to start that from scratch in the United States, and it takes a long time to build this partner ecosystem. We're finally at a point where we have a number of strong partners in the US, but it took a while to get there. Right? It's the brand name recognition. Board has lots of fantastic brands that use the software. They're very well known in Europe. They're actually pretty well known in the US, but the board name itself is just not nearly as well known in North America. And things like customer reference calls still become a little bit more of a challenge when your customer reference is located in a different time zone and has a very small window when they're willing to talk to you. Right? California to Germany is a very big difference in times, unfortunately. And it's just it becomes a little bit harder to align on all of these things. And so when you compare it to some of the competitors, especially that are local to the US market, they might have somebody who's next door who can provide a reference. So it's things like this around marketing, around partner ecosystem that really have been the biggest challenge in getting into the US market. And they just take a little bit longer to mature because you have a lot less control over them than you do over your own organization.
Totally makes sense. And so just to summarize, localize the management team is one critical pillar to follow. Then develop a strong sales partnership locally, and then build brand recognition with, I guess, significant marketing investment to build brand awareness as well in the US. Is the buying persona different in the US versus Europe? Like, do you see different CFO persona, sales cycle, different competitive dynamics?
I think overall, if you think about the CFO, CFO's priorities across the globe are more similar than different, to be honest, right? Whether you are in the US or Europe, finance leaders are fundamentally trying to solve the same problem. They're looking to improve the forecast accuracy. They're looking to increase agility, reduce manual processes, kind of all of these things that make you want to buy that EPM software for the business. The differences are more just, cultural. US is probably a little more competitive market. It's a little more vendor saturated. There's a bit more emphasis on speed of execution and scalability and proving the business impact quickly. I think Europe is a little bit more laid back on this sometimes. Europe, and I'm saying Europe, I mean, every market in Europe is different. France is different from Germany, is different from Italy, is different from the UK and from the Nordics. So it's, I'm trying to summarize what's actually a fairly complex ecosystem. But generally speaking, I think the decision making is a little bit more consensus driven in the European markets. The approach is a little bit more phased and it's just a little bit slower paced in a rational way. I think the US is a little bit more of an, let's do this quickly sort of market. But the problems that the companies are trying to solve are really the same. And the more companies are global, the more they face in macroeconomic pressure, supply chain challenges, they're really all becoming more and more the same.
So there's no significant localization needs here.
No, definitely not. I mean, look, the localization needs on occasion. If you're doing consolidation, we're very strong in European standards. We're a little weaker in American accounting standards. So if you go really deep in very specific industries, there's a little bit of consolidation that's necessary for that kind of very, very tactical, very specific functionality. But if you look at the platform as a whole, and especially when you consider board for what it is, which is a platform to do planning and a very flexible platform for that, like it's easy enough to adapt it from one to the other.
Makes sense. And from the AI perspective, do you see major differences between the US and Europe? Like, are they ahead of us, moving faster, earlier adopters, or do you see similar patterns with like overall still a nascent adoption market?
I think the patterns are similar. The US is moving a little bit faster sometimes. Like we run into very interesting situations in Europe that the American team always scratches their heads about. So, for example, and it's all around just standards of privacy and security, like GDPR is, in particular in Europe, is always something that we need to be careful about. Because, for example, I think it was ChatGPT 5.5 was released in the US data centers that we operate, but was not available in European data centers yet because they didn't fully qualify the GDPR compliances. And so it's like, we're used to having a unified stack of technologies. And we are a strong Microsoft partner, by the way, so we live in the Azure world. So you think of Azure as being not monolithic, but at least the same everywhere. That's not actually the case. So sometimes things are a little bit out of phase in Europe. Now, it's more of a few months conversation as opposed to a significant difference. But it's always, there's always something that happens.
Mm. I guess these are tricky situations to handle and harmonize. But
the world is just moving so fast that there's always a gotcha that you didn't expect, especially in a multinational business. And we'll work through them. I mean, in the big scheme of things, everybody will be the same. And when you look at it at a moment's notice, it's a little bit of a, wow, I didn't expect that to happen sort of situation.
Mm. And out of curiosity, do you have any guess estimates of kind of the upsell, cross-sell potential AI features would represent in US and or Europe? Typically, I don't know if you say taking a basis of ACV, annual contract value of 100, do you expect to have like 110 with AI features or 120? And is it something equals between Europe and US or?
I think it's still a little bit too early for us to tell. We're really not focused so much on, how much upsell we can drive. We're looking right now very much as how much adoption can it drive. And when you're in this kind of growth model, you're not as focused on kind of maximizing the ACV. You're really focused on just let's get these tools into the customer's hands to see how they use it. I think the real monetization will happen a few years from now because right now it's still too early for that. And the way that we use this technology is changing way too quickly for anybody to be able to drive a real monetization strategy. And you see that honestly, even in the big AI vendors, right? Anthropic, ChatGPT, Gemini, they're all trying to figure out what's the right pricing model and how do you balance that with the costs? Because the costs are astronomically high.
Yeah, definitely. No, but it does make sense. It's still very early and so more on the learning, testing, evangelization phase rather than it's a proven use cases that we can monetize.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. Maybe two additional questions. Beyond AI, what other major trends or risks do you see shaping the industry in the coming years?
Trying to think, for the industry, I don't think there's a significant disruptor that I see coming. In part because, finance teams are going to stay the same doing the finance job. Like we're not going to see finance evolve into something very, very different. Probably the biggest disruptor and this is where board is heading, is this kind of unification of planning, not just in finance where the EPM and FP&A tools live, but really expanding that across the organization, right? Because if you think about a manufacturer or a retail company. The finance team is only one of the parts of the company that really deals with a lot of data, but the teams that do the merchandising, the teams that do the supply chain, they often sit outside of finance, but they need access to the same data and they need to make decisions in concert with finance. As we bring this together, these teams together, that's really the big disruptor that I think is going to change how the businesses operate. It's the ability of finance to not just sit in the finance box and think about balance sheets and cash flow statements. It's the ability of finance to work very closely with other teams in the business using the same fundamental data sources. Now, that's probably different from board from everybody else, which is why I'm kind of hesitating to say, is this a disruptor? It's not a disruptor for board because that's where we're going. It will be a disruptor for somebody who says, I'm the best finance software organization, and now you don't need, now that's not enough because now the finance teams need to be outside.
Crystal clear. Makes sense. One last question, and thank you very much. For a CFO or a head of FP&A watching this video, what's the one thing or two things they should keep in mind looking forward?
So I think the most important thing for a CFO who's watching this video is this. Technology is a key enabler for making a faster, more efficient organization. But ultimately, technology can't function by itself. And a lot of companies have a tendency to focus on implementing new tools, but the real challenge is going to be in helping the teams adapt to new ways of working. Right? It's more about becoming collaborative across functions, building a culture that's comfortable making decisions in a more data-driven and continuous way. And so what people often forget when they get really invested in new technology, it's not just the technology. It's actually the people transformation and the process transformation is just as important as putting in a new system. If you put in a new system and people don't use it, it doesn't give you any benefit. And so the companies that will be really successful in this are the ones that kind of combine this technology, but also look at their processes, empower the people to use this technology in new ways, and really consume it in that form. Without people, it's all, even with AI, without people, it's not going to work.
And I guess this advice is actually quite true as well for vendors. If they want to implement
Absolutely.
AI, there is a true need for change management to support end customers to adopt these tools, make them ours, and learn how to use them properly.
Absolutely. And that's why, new companies that enter this market, they don't have this experience, to be honest, of running complex projects and making sure that it works across the business. Board, with its 20 plus years of experience, has had, unfortunately, plenty of pitfalls where we've implemented the technology and forgot to help the organization actually change the practices to start using it. And so we know, just from our vast experience and learning from our past mistakes, that you can't just do one and not do the other.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Andrew. It was super insightful. I think we are now running out of time. So I really want to thank you for accepting this interview and for all the insights shared today.
Thank you very much, Matthew.